You talk about these two systems. You refer to them as two hemispheres. And we can jump in on whichever one you like. I think I would love to dive into the lymphatic lipid system and ketosis, which you've already mentioned. And maybe we could talk about that system first so that we can then contrast it to the hepatic lipid system and a word that you have coined called glucosis, which I absolutely love. Can we talk about how this system works in the body and what life is like internally for you always living in ketosis?
Sure. First of all, let me give a very brief description of what the lymphatic system is, what the lymphatic lipid system is, starting with the fact that it is not an accepted medical term. I had to create that. Again, I talk about there's certain things that just offend my sense of what it should be right. And one of them is that when you have something that goes from point A to point Z, and it's clearly a system, why hasn't the medical community ever given that system a name? Well, that's what I found out when I had to find a name for what is now referred to as the lymphatic lipid system. Now, so I say that so that if your audience tries to Google lymphatic lipid system and they come up empty, other than perhaps getting a link to body science, they won't wonder why that is. But it is nevertheless a system, and readers have made that observation. They've said, by defining the systems of the lymphatic lipid system and the hepatic lipid system was a game changer. People have literally written me and said the ability to quantify those as a system is a game changer.
Yeah.
All right. So the lymphatic lipid system describes what happens from the moment you put something that is dietary fat in your mouth until it is oxidized within the cells for energy. And there's a whole process that goes, again, from the moment you put something that's dietary fat in your mouth until the cells burn it for energy. And I'm not going to let people read body science if they want to understand the entire thing. But I will say this: fat remains fat at all times. It's merely emulsified in the intestines. Then it's packaged up in something called a chylomicron, which has a protein structure that allows it. This is the important part: allows the structure which contains the fatty acids, the emulsified dietary fat, is then, once it's within this shell, which collectively is known as a chylomicron, then it's able to transit the intestinal wall into the body. If your audience isn't aware, medicine does not consider the intestines an internal part of the body. If there's a hole at the top and a hole at the bottom, and you can drop something in the top and it comes out the bottom, it's not considered internal. It is a pathway through the body, but it is not, medically speaking, it's not considered internal to the body. So what happens is, once the chylomicrons transit the intestinal wall, they become inside the body, and then they get taken up by lymph fluid, the lymphatic system, hence the name, the lymphatic lipid system. And then they travel in the lymph fluid up the just above the heart, and they come out in the thoracic duct, and it enters the vascular system. And these chylomicrons then at that point become like little delivery vans, and they're riding along in the blood. And I'm not going to go through the whole ApoE and ApoC and ApoE48 and all that stuff, but they offload their cargo, which is the fatty acids. They offload the fatty acids into the 100 trillion cells of your body. When they're done with that, the cargo door locks again by exchanging an enzyme, a lipoprotein. And then the chylomicron goes to the blood system. It enters the liver, where it is recognized by what lipoproteins are present, what lipoproteins are not, as something that needs to be recycled or removed from the body. And it's broken down, and the whole process begins again the next time you eat some form of dietary fat. That is essentially the short version of the lymphatic lipid system. Did I leave anything out, Casey, that you felt was meaningful?
I don't think so, but I do want to reiterate a point that you mentioned earlier. We talked about this last time. I think this is so critical. The fat that is delivered by the chylomicron is burned, period. It's not stored in long-term storage the way most people think when they eat a ton of fat, that they're just going to gain a bunch of fat. Is that correct?
Yes, let me go a step further. There is no mechanism in the body, zero, it doesn't exist, to take fatty acids, triglycerides, that are within the shell called the chylomicron, and do anything other than oxidize them for energy in the mitochondria of the 100 trillion cells of your body. There is no other mechanism. As an example, the chylomicrons, biochemically speaking, they cannot return to the liver until they've offloaded their cargo. And there's only one place and one place only they can offload their cargo. That is into the 100 trillion cells of your body where it is oxidized. There is no storage mechanism for the process of fatty acids being delivered as part of the lymphatic lipid system. There is no storage mechanism.
Wow. Wow. So I can eat more fat, but I would just have more fat energy being delivered. Thus, I might have more energy and might actually feel better.
There's probably, I'm not aware of anyone who's done the test of I'm going to eat an absolutely obsessive amount of fat, and then I'm going to have various blood tests run. But I imagine what you would see with a diet that has an insane, unhealthy amount of dietary fat would be that triglycerides would simply be high, which is definitely a negative thing. You don't want high triglycerides, but that would probably be, if I could phrase it this way, the worst of it.
Yeah, gotcha. And one of the paradoxes in Dave Feldman's study, when people do reduce their carbohydrates, is we do see that triglycerides reduce, which is really counterintuitive. You'd think they would go up, and maybe they do in a very transitory period, but they end up dropping off because we're using all of that energy. I think it's super interesting. Where do ketones fit into all of this?
Okay. So the existence of ketones and the use of ketones by the human body is the core of the genesis, the etymology of the word ketosis, and which was first coined someplace around 1920. It's in Body Science. Right in that era, 1920 was the first time somebody coined that phrase. Just hang on. What exactly did you want me to speak to? I'm trying to make sure that there's so much information. I want to get the right information.
I know. No, I really appreciate it. Just how when the cells are receiving all of this fat and they're oxidizing this fat as energy, that's when we see ketones being produced. Is that correct? And if so, what is our body using those for? What do they do?
Okay. When the body shifts into ketosis, the largest component that's being burned for energy within the 100 trillion cells of the body is fatty acids, not ketones. However, when a body is in ketosis, ketones are absolutely essential because the fatty acids cannot move through the blood-brain barrier. Ketones can. Okay? So what happens is the fatty acids arrive in the liver. The liver converts them, a percentage of them, into various ketones, or collectively known as ketone bodies. The public just calls them ketones. And then those ketones, much like the chylomicrons, they ride in the blood, but they are able to permeate the blood-brain barrier. And yeah, that's a tongue twister. And so all of the cells of your brain use ketones, not fatty acids. Now, all cells other than the brains, they burn, depending on whose estimates you believe are most accurate, either 90% fatty acids and 10% ketones, or 85% fatty acids and 15% ketones. That's our normal everyday cells throughout our body. But the brain burns exclusively ketones for energy.
Yeah, and we've learned over time that the brain, places like the brain, the heart, they much prefer running on the ketones than they do running on glucose. Is that correct?
Absolutely. The way I often characterize it is that glucose, which is what the brain runs on when a person is in glucosis, it's like diesel fuel. It's smelly and it's greasy, it's oily, and it's not as refined as some other types of fuel. Ketones are dragster fuel.
Got it.
In comparison to how it is perceived by the brain cells.
Got it. Okay.
And that manifests itself in the fact that virtually everybody who chooses to live in ketosis, usually within like 2 or 3 weeks after making the shift, they report an astounding phenomenon of additional brain clarity. Suddenly, everything makes more sense. Things that didn't make sense do make sense. Suddenly, they can focus more intently on things like, for instance, when they're studying. And that's because that's the reaction of the brain when it clears out all of the garbage from having to burn glucose and begins now burning pristine ketones. That's why people talk about dramatic brain clarity increase.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. This reminds me of a recent podcast that you did. Maybe this is a good time to talk about this. I thought this was fantastic. And anecdotally, I see this all the time when people start eating in a way that puts them into ketosis. You write about things that make people angry sometimes. You talk about politics and finances, and there can be a lot of passion and emotion behind these things. But you talk about the way that you used to do things versus the way you do things now. And there's a vast difference. And I find that so fascinating. And again, anecdotally, I see it all the time. Can you comment on that?
Sure. What Casey is referring to is what sort of put me on the social media map at one time was I used to do these things called angry truck rants. And we know today a lot of people do shoot videos in their vehicles. But when I first started doing that, it was incredibly rare. And something would just inflame me, some political event or some act of mass violence, something like that. And I would sit in my truck and I would have the cell phone up on the dashboard. And I would get into the subject and I'd start talking and I'd get lit and I'd get more emotional. And by the end, I'd be screaming and yelling. And as I said in the video you're referencing, it was pretty cathartic to get that out like that, because of course, we're not allowed to be angry in our current society. So being able to sit there and vent that was pretty cathartic. But and like one of them was seen by 1.7 million people on Facebook, and it was actually featured on the Drudge Report. That's how popular those truck rants were back in the day. So people still pine away for those. I guess comments on social media all the time. Well, this would be a great subject for a truck rant. But that level of emotional response, since I've been living in ketosis, that's just not there anymore. I still have the same exact intellectual understanding of these type of events when I see them. I still hold the same viewpoint. I still feel the same angst to an extent when I see innocent people being harmed and things like that. When I see politicians trying to, under the guise of helping, they're actually harming. These things still make me very unhappy. But that sense of anger that I vented in those truck rants, it's just not there anymore. If I were to do a truck rant today, I mean, never say never, right? But if I were to do a truck rant today, my supposition as I sit here is that kind of anger, I would have to contrive it, because I just don't feel it like I did then. And the only difference between then and now is I was in glucosis and now I'm in ketosis. And to take it a step further, I would say that, and I know that this may be difficult for people to grasp if they haven't read body science, that my body was unhealthy. And I think that has an emotional impact. And now living in ketosis, my body's healthy and happy. It's being fed the way it's being genetically coded to be fed. So I think that also has an effect on the emotional component. And I still want to affect change. And I still want innocent people not to be harmed. And I still want politicians to shut the fuck up when they're saying things that are disingenuous and harmful. But I can't imagine doing an angry truck rant anymore.
Yeah. You know,
much to the disappointment of many people who've been following me for years.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. And I only know the Dave from 2021 who was kind enough to send me his book. I only know that one. And you and I have been able to talk on our interviews and offline. And you're a super friendly guy. I consider you one of my friends. You're very balanced, and we get to talk about different opinions. And I see that in you, and I see that in other people when they switch over. So I really appreciate you commenting on that.